spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee.
Edgar Allan Poe. The name alone conjures up images of ravens, beating hearts, disturbed graves, undead women, and bereaved lovers. A key figure of dark romanticism, Poe was a master of Gothic horror, mystery, and the macabre, remembered for poems like The Raven, The Bells, and Annabel Lee, and short stories like The Telltale Heart and The Pit and the Pendulum. But Poe is also considered the father of the modern detective story. His fictional Inspector C. Auguste Dupin, a predecessor of the likes of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue thrilled Victorian audiences through Poe's genius use of ratiocination. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, said, "Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" But perhaps the greatest mystery America's first mystery writer left us was the mystery surrounding his own death. On October 3, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore outside a tavern, delirious and in great distress. His trunk was missing, and he was apparently wearing someone else's clothes. He had left Richmond a week earlier for New York, but somehow ended up on the streets of Baltimore, half frozen and out of his mind. There are no surviving accounts of what happened during that ensuing week, and Poe never regained enough lucidity to explain his condition. He was taken to the hospital in a stupor, becoming one day violently delirious, addressing spectral and imaginary objects in the room, to gravely sedated the next. He suffered 4 agonizing days until, according to his doctor, quietly moving his head, he said, "Lord, help my poor soul," and expired. It was October 7, 1849. Edgar Allan Poe was 40. His death certificate has been lost, and no cause of death has ever been determined, leading to wide speculation ranging from brain disease to alcoholism, even murder. But contemporary poet Charles Baudelaire remarked, "This death was almost a suicide prepared for a long time." Despite being one of the most well-known writers of his day, Poe died in poverty. There was little ceremony at his funeral, attended by only about 8 people, and lasting just a few minutes. He was buried in a simple mahogany coffin near this spot in the Westminster burial grounds here in Baltimore, close to his grandfather David Poe and brother Henry. 11 years after burial, a cousin paid for a monument, but in a freak accident that could have sprung from one of Poe's bizarre tales, a train derailed and crashed into the stone yard where the stone was made, destroying it before it could even be placed. And so Poe's quiet grave remained unmarked. But this was not the end of Edgar Allan Poe's journey. Decades later, in the 1870s, a local school teacher and students raised funds to have a permanent monument to Poe created. In the fall of 1875, Edgar Allan Poe was exhumed, risen from the grave like so many of his characters. To properly identify him, the coffin was opened, one witness noting, "The skull was in excellent condition. The shape of the forehead, one of Poe's striking features, was easily discerned." Poe was removed from his original burial place behind Westminster Hall to be relocated to a place of prominence and honor in the graveyard, close to the front gate. As the coffin was being moved, pieces of it broke off and were quickly snatched up by admirers who were present for the event. Edgar Allan Poe's journey ended here. In this new tomb, Poe's final resting place, was dedicated on November 17th, 1875. Edgar Allan Poe's legacy of dark tales featuring love and loss was hard-earned. In this early Victorian era, there was a preoccupation with death. Mourning had become fashionable. But for Poe, it was not a fashion he simply wore. It was his reality. Perhaps his best-known work is The Raven, the poem that would earn him both critical and popular acclaim worldwide, though very little money, just $9. Like a rock star of today, when Poe would walk down the street, dressed all in black, people would call him the Raven, shouting out the poem's famous refrain, "Nevermore." To hear Poe recite The Raven was said to be the experience of one's life. The audience seemed almost to hear the evil bird ominously croaking his nevermore, afraid to draw the next breath, lest the enchanted spell be broken. But there was deep personal meaning behind the narrator's lament for the lost Lenore. A common thread throughout the writings of Poe is the death of a beautiful woman, whose presence somehow remains. In analyzing his own composition process for The Raven, he explains that the death of a beautiful woman is, unquestionably, the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. Poe was himself, all too often, that bereaved lover. He was a man who loved too deeply for the tragedies that continually befell him. Women were to him the greatest sources of beauty, of succor, of love, of caring and tenderness, of goodness and inspiration. They were pure poetry, but they were fragile beings, too fragile. And every new love for Poe brought with it the terrifying possibility of another loss, of renewed heartbreak. And so we have poems and stories like The Raven, Annabel Lee, The Fall of the House of Usher, Morella, Berenice, Lenore, Ligeia, The Oblong Box, and Ulalume, where a beautiful young woman dies, but whose presence remains, haunting the bereaved with a need to remember, but a wish to forget. Literary scholars, and even Poe himself, attribute the inspiration of these dead-alive women to multiple women in Poe's own life. But it's unclear exactly who was the inspiration for which. Who are you?
Sing with me now on this gala night, a song for the angels. Watch with me now in this tale of fright, puppets as they come and go. Eddie, my boy. Eddie. Mama. Eddie. Mama!
To the Humane Heart. On this night, Mrs. Poe, lingering on the bed of disease and surrounded by her children, asks your assistance, and asks it perhaps for the last time. So read the plea for help that went out to theater-goers in November 1811 on behalf of Eliza Poe. Her husband had abandoned her and their 3 children, and she lay on her deathbed. The Mrs. Poe here was Edgar's mother, known and beloved not only to theater-goers in Richmond but throughout the country. She was one of the nation's most popular actresses, admired for not just her acting, but the sweetness of her singing voice and the grace of her dancing. Mrs. Poe is a brilliant gem in the theatric crown, said one reviewer. She toured city to city playing hundreds of roles, from comedic ingenues to Shakespearean roles. But this was an age when acting was seen as just one step above prostitution. Still, she was so beloved by the society ladies of Richmond that the call to the Humane Heart was answered, and she and her children were looked after until her death from tuberculosis at the age of 24. By the death of this lady, news articles read, the stage has been deprived of one of its chief ornaments. As a child, Poe saw his mother die on stage night after night as Ophelia or Juliet, but she always came back to life. Until that bleak December, when little Eddie was not yet 3 years old, and she didn't come back. For a child that age, this would have been difficult to comprehend, to reconcile, and for the rest of his life, his writings would reflect this inner turmoil as to whether or not death was real or permanent. The young women who die in his stories in one form or another often come back to life.
These are the full and the black and the wild eyes of my lost love, of the Lady Ligeia.
Rising from the dead, just as Eliza had done so often on stage. Edgar was proud to be Eliza's son. He was proud of her work as an actress and attributed his creative gifts to her. And however dim his recollections may have been of her, Eliza was an ever-present force in his life and work. Edgar described her to be as pure, as angelic, and altogether lovely as any woman could be on earth. And in a way, she was by his side for the rest of his life, in the form of a small oval portrait she left him. Eliza's grave here at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, remained unmarked until 1927, when this marker was placed by various Edgar Allan Poe foundations, a monument to Eliza Poe, the mother of the Raven. Eliza? Is that who you are?
Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicaean barks of yore.
This must be Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond. One of Poe's favorite haunting grounds, he was known to take frequent Sunday evening strolls here with his wife, Virginia. But as a teenage boy, it was another love that drew him here. And this is her grave. Jane Stanard, whom he called Helen, after Helen of Troy, considered in Greek mythology as the most beautiful woman who ever lived. Poe began writing as a teenager, the beginning of a career that biographer Kenneth Silverman would describe as a sort of prolonged mourning. That mourning began as a child with his mother, but continued when a teenager of about 14. Jane Stanard was the mother of one of his schoolmates, a woman he knew for about a year, but grew to love deeply, with all the affections of a devoted son. One of his early poems, titled To Helen, was written for Jane Stanard. Poe said that he wrote this poem in his passionate boyhood, to the first purely ideal love of his soul. She was an angel to Poe's forlorn and darkened nature. It was not a romantic love young Eddie had for Jane, but an ideal, the love of a woman as a giver of care and affection. In 1824, Jane began suffering from a death-like illness and died insane at age 31. Poe mourned her like she was his own mother, nightly visiting her grave here at Shockoe Hill Cemetery, unable to endure to think of her lying there, forsaken and forgotten.
Yes, God, help thee, crazy Jane.
Edgar?
Wait! Are you Jane Stanard?
Perhaps. But there was a real mother figure in young Edgar Poe's life. Alan. And here she is, so close to Jane. Frances Allen, known as Fanny. One of the society ladies who came to the aid of Eliza Poe after she was struck ill was Frances Allen, wife of wealthy merchant John Allen. After Eliza's death, her children each went to different foster homes. Little Edgar Poe was taken in and fostered by the Allen family, and though never formally adopted, was baptized as Edgar Allan Poe. In this comfortable upbringing, Edgar was afforded the liberal education that would prime his love of literature and reciting poetry. Fanny loved Edgar like her own son, and is said to have resembled Eliza in many ways. Poe's affections were reciprocated, calling her Ma, but Fanny was often sick. When Poe went off to the army, letters home to John Allen always asked after the health of Fanny, asking to send "my dearest love to Ma." In 1829, when Edgar was around 20, Fanny's illness took a serious turn. In her final hours, she greatly desired to see Edgar. Frances Allen died on February 28th at the age of 45. Edgar managed a military leave, but was unable to arrive until the day after her burial here at Shockoe Hill Cemetery. The grief of losing his foster mother was magnified by the guilt of having left her in that condition, and not being able to make it back to see her before her death and burial. Grief, it seems, would be Edgar's stock and store for the rest of his life. With the death of his foster mother and having never been formally adopted, Edgar once again felt like a man without a familial foundation. John Allen was usually kind to Edgar in his upbringing, but he never really saw him as a son, and their relationship, ever tumultuous in later years, would eventually dissolve entirely without the unifying force of Fanny Allen. John assisted adult Edgar on occasion, but Edgar would receive no inheritance, leaving the struggling author and poet to live out his life in a poverty much contrasted against the comfort of his upbringing. By his 20s, the House of Allen had crumbled, just like the House of Usher in one of his most famous Gothic tales. Eliza Poe was dead. Jane Stanard was dead. And Fanny Allen was dead. The death of each reopening and amplifying the wounds of the previous.
Lenore?
Where are you? Tell me, what is your name?
I've been brought back to the Westminster burial ground, and for good reason. Two of the women most dear to Poe in his life are buried here, on either side of him. Edgar Poe was a young man now, and his lifelong need for a stable family seemed ever to elude him. "I have many occasional dealings with adversity," he once said, "but the want of parental affection has been the heaviest of my trials." Around 1833, he moved in with his aunt, Maria Clemm, and cousins, who would then on be a source of familial affection for Edgar. Maria was the sister of Edgar's father, David Poe, who Edgar had hardly known as a baby. The widowed Maria and her children were of his own blood, and for the first time Edgar felt he was a part of a real family unit. He would call her Muddy, and soon she was not his aunt. She was for him, in every sense, his mother. She cared for and looked after Edgar like her own son throughout the rest of his life. Not long before Poe died, he wrote a poem titled "To My Mother," written for Muddy, which reads in part, "Because I feel that, in the heavens above, the angels, whispering to one another, can find among their burning terms of love none so devotional as that of mother." After Edgar died suddenly in Baltimore, Maria, who was alone back at the Fordham cottage in New York, didn't receive the news until after his burial, depriving her the opportunity to say goodbye and attend his funeral.
God, have mercy on me, for he was the last I had to cling to and love.
Maria Clemm would outlive not only Edgar, but all of her children, and was laid to rest here to the right of Poe, along with one of her daughters, a young woman who would become a key figure in the life and writings of Edgar Allan Poe. Young, with large violet eyes, raven hair, and a pearly white complexion that gave her an unearthly look, almost like that of a disrobed spirit, possessing a disposition of surpassing sweetness. This description paints for us a picture of Virginia Clemm, Poe's darling little cousin. He grew very fond of Virginia in the years they lived together, and soon came to love her dearly. And in 1836, with Mariah's blessing, they would marry. He 27, she just 13. Their relationship in those early years was seen more as a brother and sister relationship. Poe would affectionately refer to her as Sissy, saw to her education, and for the first few years of marriage, they didn't even share a room. Whatever the nature of their relationship, they grew to be a happy and devoted couple. His love for his wife was a sort of rapturous worship of the spirit of beauty. And Virginia idolized Edgar, sitting close to him while he wrote. She would even channel what she learned from Edgar, writing an acrostic Valentine's Day poem to him in 1846. In an acrostic poem, the first letter of each line spells out a word or phrase. In the case of Virginia's Valentine, it spelled out Edgar Allan Poe.
Ever with thee I wish to roam. Dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home. And the rain shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours, ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful will be.
Virginia was Poe's greatest muse of this, his most productive era, for better or worse. Eddie and Sissy loved to play music and sing together at the piano. But one episode at the piano in 1842 would haunt Poe for the rest of his life.
6 years ago, a wife whom I loved as no man ever loved before, ruptured a blood vessel in singing. The rose tint upon her cheek was too bright, too pure to be of the earth. It was consumption's color, that sadly beautiful light which beckons to an early tomb.
It was the deceptively beautiful rosy specter of the romantic disease, tuberculosis, known then as consumption. Being young and otherwise healthy, the disease did not quickly claim Virginia. She battled it for 5 long years. During this period, she became mostly bedridden, oscillating between the brink of death and recovery. Writing in the next room over, Virginia's coughs were a constant reminder in Poe's ears that the grave beckoned his beloved. Poe experienced the torment of Virginia's death not once but countless times. She would seemingly die and be reanimated, only to die again, just like the dead-alive women in his stories, and just as his mother had done on stage. Poe's own words best describe this horrible oscillation between hope and despair.
Each time I felt all the agonies of her death, and at each accession of the disorder I loved her more dearly and clung to her life with more desperate pertinacity. With long intervals of horrible sanity.
During the agony of Virginia's prolonged illness, much of Poe's writings reflected the specter of her impending death, like Lenore, the oblong box, the Mask of the Red Death, Eleonora, and of course, the Raven. The ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, emblematic of the mournful and never-ending remembrance of a lost love. It was loss Poe had experienced many times in his life, and within a few years would experience again with his beloved wife. Virginia Eliza Clemm Poe, who not only physically resembled Eliza Poe, but shared her name, died from tuberculosis in 1847 at the age of 24. The same age and from the same illness as Poe's mother. He was reliving his earliest trauma. At Virginia's funeral, Poe refused to look at her face, preferring to remember her how she was. After the funeral, Poe took out a copy of his 1845 poem Eulalie, which reads in part, "I dwelt alone in a world of moan, and my soul was a stagnant tide, till the fair and gentle Eulalie became my blushing bride." His blushing bride now buried, he returned to that world of moan from which Virginia had rescued him, scribbling into the margins of this manuscript, "Deep in earth my love is lying, and I must weep alone." After Virginia's death came works like Ulalume, in which a bereaved lover unknowingly wanders to the door of his deceased love's tomb, and Annabel Lee, which also tells of a bereaved lover who lies down by the side of his young bride in her tomb by the sea. Annabel Lee was Poe's very last poem, and Virginia is believed to have been the inspiration. The best-known image of Virginia Poe was this deathbed portrait, painted hours after she died. The life still there upon her hair, the death upon her eyes. Virginia was laid to rest in a cemetery near their Fordham cottage in New York. Poe sunk into a deep depression, medicating his grief with alcohol, not caring if he lived another minute. The illness and death of his wife were to him the greatest evil that could befall a man. It would be just over 2 years until Edgar would join her in the grave. But he was laid to rest in Baltimore, 200 miles from his beloved. Decades later, the cemetery where Virginia lay in New York had been all but forgotten and destroyed. An early Poe biographer reportedly visited the cemetery in 1883 at the exact moment the sexton was about to discard Virginia's bones as unclaimed. He claimed them and kept her bones in a box under his bed for 2 years until they were finally able to be reburied here alongside Edgar in 1885. After the deaths of Edgar and Virginia, friend and poet Francis Osgood said of Virginia,
"She was the only woman he ever truly loved."
"Surely then this revenant who haunts me is Poe's beloved Virginia." Are you Virginia? Are you? Tell me who you are. Tell me who you are. What is your name? Tell me who you are. What is your name? Tell me! Where have you brought me now, Psyche? Francis Sargent Osgood. I'll be damned. She's brought me to Mount Auburn Cemetery near Boston. Fanny Osgood very much resembled both Eliza and Virginia, her pallid complexion showing early signs of the same disease Virginia was dying from when she met Poe, and she shared the same name as Poe's foster mother. Perhaps it was fated that Edgar should find her. With the success of The Raven, Poe's newfound rock star status made him popular amongst the literary ladies of the time, a regular figure at the literary salons. Among those who frequented these soirees was one of the era's most renowned female poets, Frances Sargent Osgood. She was enthralled by Poe's readings of The Raven. Poe, too, was most impressed by the talents of Frances Osgood, which he described as of no common order. As editor of the Broadway Journal, Poe would see to the publication of many of Osgood's poems. After meeting in 1845, the two began a public poetic flirtation through the back and forth side-by-side publication of verse.
I know a noble heart that beats, for one it loves how wildly well. I only know for whom it beats, but I must never tell, never tell.
Beloved, amid the earnest woes that crowd around my earthly path, drear path, alas, where grows not even one lovely rose, my soul at least a solace hath in dreams of thee, and therein knows an Eden of bland repose.
And ever the fan of puzzles and cryptography, Poe published A Valentine in 1846, in which each subsequent letter of each subsequent line reveals the name of the poem's subject, Frances Sargent Osgood. The love between Edgar and Fanny was principally platonic, as dear friends and creative equals. He saw her as the intellectual feminine ideal. Even Virginia approved of the relationship, becoming herself friends with Fanny. The grief over Virginia's illness had driven Poe to drink and self-destructive behavior, and Virginia believed that his friendship with Fanny had a sobering effect on him. But their relationship wouldn't last. Poe didn't lose Fanny to the grave, but to the tattling of tongues. The gossip and scandal that erupted from their public flirtations demanded, for both their sakes, that they stop seeing one another. Fanny Osgood died at the age of 38 from tuberculosis just months after Poe died. Her grief upon hearing of Poe's death said to have hastened her own. Her grave, like Poe's, features a lyre, which was a symbol in that era of the creative wisdom and skills of a poet. The placement of the lyre here was inspired by her final poem, The Hand That Swept the Sounding Lyre, which was written as a requiem to Edgar Allan Poe.
The hand that swept the sounding lyre with more than mortal skill, the lightning eye, the heart of fire, the fervent lip are still. No more in rapture or in woe, with melody to thrill. Ah, nevermore.
The lyre here was designed with 5 strings, one for each member of the Osgood family. 4 strings were cut to symbolize the deaths of Fanny and her 3 daughters. One daughter, Fanny Fay Osgood, was conceived during a period in which Frances was estranged from her husband, Samuel, and she was involved with Poe. This has led some to speculate that little Fanny Fay may have been the daughter of Poe, and that her death in the lonesome October of 1847 at the age of 1 may have been the real inspiration for Ulalume, published shortly thereafter. The 5th string of the lyre was cut when Frances's husband, Samuel, died. Samuel Osgood was a painter who painted a portrait not only of Frances, but also the only known portrait of Poe painted from life. Frances. Is that you? Virginia was dead. Francis Osgood was no longer in his life, and the ever-gloomy Poe felt he had very little to live for. For the final 2 years of his life, he pursued several women, often simultaneously, in an attempt to fill the void that Virginia's death had left. He felt a great desire to remarry, but also a hesitance. Would doing so betray the dead? The dead who, as they do in his stories, may return in wrath. Resting here in the North Burial Ground in Providence, Rhode Island, is Sarah Helen Whitman, a sophisticated, albeit eccentric woman who was another of the great writers and essayists of the era. She well knew of Poe's work, once recounting,
I can never forget the impressions I felt in reading a story of his for the first time. I experienced a sensation of such intense horror that I neither dared look at anything he had written, nor even utter his name. By degrees, this terror took the character of fascination. I devoured with a half-reluctant and fearful avidity every line that fell from his pen.
In 1848, Helen was commissioned to write some poems for a Valentine's Day soiree. Believing Poe would be in attendance, she included one to Edgar Allan Poe.
O thou grim and ancient raven, from the night's Plutonian shore, oft in dreams thy ghastly pinions wave and flutter round my door. Oft thy shadow dims the moonlight, sleeping on my chamber floor.
Poe had not been in attendance, but later learned of the poem. He responded immediately, sending her a copy of his poem to Helen, the one inspired by Jane Stanard, who, you'll recall, young Edgar called Helen. Like Jane Stanard, Helen was an older woman who would soon command Edgar's deepest affections. In some ways, she was, for Poe, the ghost of the Helen of his youth returned from the dead amid the entombing trees. The dead do not stay dead for Edgar Allan Poe. In May of that year, he composed a new poem, also titled To Helen, this one written specifically for Sarah Helen Whitman, leaving no doubt about the intensity of his feelings and how his first sight of her had left him haunted.
Clad all in white upon a violet bank, I saw thee, half reclining, while the moon fell upon the upturned faces of the roses, and on thine own, upturned, alas, in sorrow.
He found in Sarah Helen Whitman his mystical twin, a kindred spirit. Around Providence, where she lived, Helen was known not just for her writing, but for her pagan dress and interest in spiritualism and the occult. Poe and Helen found harmony in topics such as death, sorrow, and the afterlife. She would keep various memento mori, including a coffin pendant she wore around her neck, and flowers from the graves of Keats and Shelley pressed in her scrapbook. In the fall of 1848, the two began a romantic courtship, he wooing her with readings of Ulalume at the Athenaeum Library. They would also stroll amongst the tombstones at Swan Point Cemetery in Rhode Island. Cemeteries were a popular destination for romantic outings in that era. So in true Poe form, it was there that he would propose marriage to Helen. In Poe, Helen found an exciting younger man, but she dared not respond. She was hesitant for a number of reasons. Her mother strongly disapproved of the relationship, as did many of her New England acquaintances, who looked down on Poe. Furthermore, Helen had a heart condition, one she feared would prematurely end her life. She believed that the very act of making love would kill her.
Were I to allow myself to love you, I could only enjoy a bright, brief hour of rapture and die.
This once again presented Edgar with the real possibility of facing another loss, of renewed mourning. Yet he pursued her all the same, almost inviting the heartbreak, just as the bereaved narrator did in his inquiries to the Raven, knowing the answer inevitably to be, nevermore. Poe repeatedly invoked that species of despair which delights in self-torture. Their courtship would continue to undergo a series of oscillations before Helen eventually agreed to a conditional engagement. the conditions being that he completely stop drinking and that her mother approve. Neither condition was met. The tumultuous engagement came to an end 2 days before Christmas, their chosen wedding date. The opposition of Helen's mother, Poe's broken promises of sobriety, and many admonitions of her friends against marrying Poe finally wore her down. Poe pleaded with her, but feeling trapped, perhaps seeking a way out, Helen drenched her handkerchief in ether, inhaled the vapors, and swooned on the sofa. As the ether took effect, Poe begged her for but one word.
I love you.
These were the last words she ever spoke to him. She did not die, but she lay there before him, alive but lifeless. Another specter of the lost women who haunted Poe. Helen left Poe in intense sorrow and never stopped loving him. After his death, she would continue writing to keep Poe's legacy alive, and with a deep interest in spiritualism and the occult, Helen would also hold seances, attempting to communicate with the spirit of Edgar Allan Poe. Helen?
This is nothing but dreaming. A dream within a dream. Or a nightmare.
Who are you?
What is written on the door of this tomb? Annie. Poe's mental and physical health deteriorated gravely in the years that followed Virginia's illness and death. Brain fever, it was said. He believed, as did those around him, that he was not long for this world. Believed, and perhaps wished, to be cured of the fever called living. He needed, as very much a matter of life and death, that sustaining love that was more than love, that he had had with Sissy. This he found in a young woman named Nancy Richmond, whom he called Annie. At the same time that he was courting Helen, Poe had developed a close relationship with Annie, who lived in Lowell, Massachusetts, and was married. Their relationship threatened neither adultery nor divorce. It was childlike, as two siblings. Annie was the ghost of his sweet Sissy, a caretaking angel. Even if he married someone else, he had expressed a desire to live in Lowell, to be close to Annie. And after the breakup with Helen, it was to Annie that Poe returned. Distraught over losing Helen and his myriad career woes, Poe attempted suicide by ingesting laudanum. He had written a letter to Annie asking that in this event she should come to his deathbed. Poe survived and would later chronicle this event in his 1849 poem titled For Annie, which treats death as a return to infantile bliss.
But my heart, it is brighter than all of the many stars in the sky, for it sparkles with Annie. It glows with the light of the love of my Annie, with the thought of the light of the eyes of my Annie.
His passion for Annie grew, telling Muddy,
I worship her beyond all human love. Do not tell me anything about Annie unless you can tell me that Mr. Richmond is dead.
But the truth was he could not have her. Any thoughts of marriage to Annie would be forever out of reach, as both she and her husband outlived Poe. After the death of her husband, Nancy Richmond officially changed her name to Annie, the name Poe had given her. Are you Annie? No, I don't believe you are. There was another, wasn't there? A last and a first love. To understand Poe's last love, we must go back to his first, because they are one and the same. We're back at Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, where rest Jane Stanard and the Allens. Here too lies the woman known as the first and last romantic love of Edgar Allan Poe. Sarah Elmira Royster was 15 and Edgar Poe was 16 when their relationship began. It was that idyllic, fanciful kind of love only to be found in youth. Before Edgar left for university, the two secretly became engaged. They wrote to each other while he was away, yet neither heard from the other, and their engagement ended. The tragedy of their love story is that each believed the other had abandoned them. But what really happened was Elmira's father had intercepted Edgar's letters to Elmira and destroyed them. Conversely, he had discarded Elmira's letters to Edgar. Elmira's father strongly disapproved of her relationship with Edgar. He was an orphan, the son of an actress, disowned by his foster father, and an aspiring writer. 4 strikes against him in this era of socioeconomic high-mindedness. Young Edgar faced heartbreak upon returning home from school when he attended a party at Elmira's home, only to discover it was her engagement party to Alexander Shelton. This would inspire one of his earliest poems, Song, published in 1827. It tells of a bride whose blush belies the hidden regret of a lost love, the narrator. But this was not the end of their story. More than 20 years later, Poe would re-enter Elmira's life. By then he was a widower, she a widow. In 1849, Poe headed south to Richmond to give lectures and continue his efforts to get his magazine, The Stylus, off the ground. He had a powerful sense of unease about this trip, telling Muddy he feared it would be his last. But he went all the same. While there, Edgar sought out his childhood love, his first fiancée, Elmira. He showed up at her house here on Gray Street, a sort of full-circle moment for Edgar as Elmira lived right across the street from St. John's Church, in view of the final resting place of Poe's mother, Eliza. And just as he had done as a teenager, Poe began courting Elmira once again. They were each to the other a powerful connection to the past, to young and innocent love. Poe would recite his poetry to her, assuring her she was his lost Lenore and Annabel Lee. Poe gave her a ring with his name engraved in it, and they were, at least tentatively, engaged to be married in October. But just like their first engagement, this second engagement would go unfulfilled. On September 27th, Poe left Richmond for a short business trip north. The evening before he left, Elmira recalled, he was very sad and complained of being quite sick. She would never see him again. Poe was discovered a week later on the streets of Baltimore, half alive. He was taken to the hospital, where he died under mysterious conditions 4 days later. Shortly before passing, he made a reference to his wife in Richmond, likely referring to Elmira. Poe was committed to the earth before Elmira even learned of his death, depriving her, as Muddy, the opportunity to say goodbye. After receiving the terrible news, Elmira wrote to Muddy, calling Edgar the dearest object to me on earth. In her later years, Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton was sometimes called Poe's lost Lenore. Even her obituary bore the headline, Poe's first and last love. Elmira's grave remained unmarked next to this tabletop marker of her husband until 2012, when the Poe Museum here in Richmond facilitated the placement of this marker. It features an excerpt from Annabel Lee, Edgar Allan Poe's final poem, first published as part of his own obituary. Elmira is considered one of the strong candidates for the inspiration of Annabel Lee, especially this line, she was a child and I was a child. But another line in the poem, and so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, implies the only woman who was his bride, Virginia. Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. Annie. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child and I was a child in this kingdom by the sea, Elmira. But we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee, an idealized love, Jane, Fanny. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted, her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea, Virginia. The angels not half so happy in heaven went envying her and me, a spiritual love, Helen. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of a cloud by night, an airborne illness, tuberculosis, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. I know who you are. You're not Elmira. You're not Virginia or Eliza, or Annie or Frances or Helen or Jane, or any one of them. You are all of them. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. Never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Sing with me now on this gala night, a song for the angels. Watch with me now in this tale of fright, puppets as they come